Hey families, welcome to class 11. I wanted to introduce you to another one of my heroes and someone to whom I owe my livelihood, and that is Gregor Mendel. So let's, as always, begin with the timeline. So we left off with Charles Darwin, and my goodness, that timeline is getting pretty populated. Um, Things are getting really exciting in the 19th century, and they're getting really exciting on your timeline too, given all the amazing experiments you've done. Um, so after Charles Darwin, Charles Darwin, as we mentioned, published The Origin of Species in 1859, or sorry, On an Origin of Species. And the one thing that he knew to be missing from his work was how new variations in a species arose, right? He could see very clearly with pigeon fancying, for example, that a new trait would arise and fanciers would try to create a true breeding stock of pigeons from it. But how it arose, he had no idea. But there was someone who did, and his name was Gregor Mendel. So he presented a paper on his findings about 6 years after Darwin published Origin of Species in 1865. So let's streamline this timeline a little bit. So as you can see in the 19th century, we've got Lamarck and Lyell and Cuvier and Darwin and now Mendel. So let's talk a little bit about Mendel. I gave the timeline of his life really because I wanted to illustrate his struggles with mental health. So he was born in Poland in 1822, and when he was a young man, he was studying at the Philosophical Institute in Olmütz, um, but he had to take a hiatus um, because he was suffering from depression and physical exhaustion, so he had to go home for a little bit. A couple of years later, he entered the Augustinian Abbey, or one of the Augustinian abbeys, because he wanted to continue to pursue his academic work. Um, but his work at the Abbey involved visiting the sick and dying patients in hospitals, and that triggered him, and he had a major depressive episode. His abbot ultimately said, "You don't have to keep doing this. This isn't good for you." So he assigned Mendel to teaching. Um, so a few years later, and for several years, right, from 1856 to 1863, so at least 7 years, he conducted experiments on pea plants, and tracked over 20,000 data points. And I really want to illustrate that, um, you saw this with Nettie Stevens and with Darwin and with Linnaeus and Cuvier, that there's science isn't just a flash of inspiration. It takes a lot of dedication and a lot of work. But it's joyful work, right? Clearly, Aristotle loved just dissections and observing catfish for hours, and you know what I mean? They all just cherish living things. Um, so um, Mendel continued his studies around this time and had another nervous breakdown during his secondary school teaching certification exams. He ultimately did pass the exams with flying colors, but you can see that over and over again, he really struggled with depression. And so here's another case where, the way scientists tend to be presented in media is very, fair to say, monolithic, right? They're kind of awkward and, sort of amoral at best and evil at worst. Um, but they're just like us, right? Some of them have real mental health struggles, and some of them don't know what they want to be when they grow up, and you know what I mean? So, I really want you to s- recognize yourself in these heroes. Not necessarily, it's not like you have to have mental health problems, but um, know that they're people too. Um, eh, but people who did work for which we benefit so much. Okay. So I think Mendel knew that he had the key that Darwin was looking for. I'm not sure Darwin knew about him. For one thing, Mendel's work was burned in a fire at some point. It's not like he burned it himself. I think there was a fire in the Abbey or something. Um, so a lot of it was lost, but thank goodness he'd had it presented and published publicly so that it could be found. And after his death in 1884, um, his work was independently confirmed by DeVry, Correns, and I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this name, Sherm, Shermock. Um, so that was really incredible. Okay, so what did he actually do? Now, he didn't just breed pea plants, but as you've seen, he put a lot of work into it. So I wanted to have some actual pictures of the pea plant he was working with. And he um, had several, at least 7 true breeding um, strains of these pea plants. So for instance, you can see there were different strains of height, right? True breeding plants that were tall and true breeding plants that were dwarf. Different, um, sort of arrangement of the flowers, either apical, so kind of like out on the sides, or terminal, just at the top. Different colors of pea pods, different shapes of pea pod, so yellow or green color pea pods, um, pea pods that were constricted or inflated. The peas themselves, they become cotyledons when they start growing into new plants, and they could either be green or yellow as well. And I think that was independent of whether or not the pods themselves were green or yellow. Um, the peas could be wrinkled or smooth, and the flowers could be white or purple. Um, so he had a lot to work with here. So how did he do his experiments? For me, this wasn't really talked about much, but I was really curious, so I'm sharing it with you. Um, so, he would, so the flower has both the male and female um, sporophyte stages within this plant. Um, so what he did was he snipped away the plant's sort of male generation. The oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on the name here. The stamens, um, and leaving just the female carpel, right? And then he would take a paintbrush and brush the bristles along the stamens of, the male pollen forming organs of the plant he wanted to use to breed, with the carpel, the female, um, ovum producing organs, of the other plants, so he could control what heritable traits were being passed on. Um, as opposed to, like if you were just leave both the stamens and the carpel, right? It's very possible that the plant can self-fertilize essentially. This allowed him to control, again, what heritable traits were being um, delivered, I guess. Okay, so well, he ultimately came up with 3 laws of inheritance. And remember what the context would have been at this time, right? If you look at people, right? If you've got a tall parent and a short parent, sometimes like oftentimes the kids tend to be somewhere in the middle. They might be medium height, right? So it wasn't crazy to think that um, inheritance was a matter of blending and then it could be infinitely blended, right? So that, if you had a medium parent with a short parent, they would be like medium small, they'd have medium small kids, and if those medium small kids um, ended up having kids with short parents, they'd be small, medium, smallish. I mean, um, the idea that, or maybe you might expect that if a parent with blue eyes and a parent with brown eyes had kids, it would be sort of a mix of the two. And if those kids with the mixed eye color had kids with had kids with a parent who had green eyes, then it would be a mix of brown, blue, and green eyes. So what we would have expected if you bred a tall pea plant with a dwarf pea plant is maybe a plant that's sort of medium height. And what he actually found, and this led to his first law of inheritance, which is the law of dominance, is that all the plants were tall. They weren't even medium. They certainly weren't short, but there weren't even medium ones. There was no blending at all. They were all tall. So that was kind of weird. Um, so the second thing he did as a kind of follow-up was to take the children, right? You've got the parent generation, their kids, if you will, he bred together. And he could have either done like self-fertilization with these plants or had, two kids from the first generation, the F1 generation, breed with each other. Either way, what you got in the second generation was, well, as follows. Again, there was no blending, sort of reinforcing this idea of the law of dominance. Um, but surprisingly, the dwarf um, sorry, the dwarf trait didn't go away, which you might expect, right? Like it just didn't disappear from the population. Um, uh, Rather, 75% of the second generation, the grandchildren, were tall, and 25% were dwarf. So that's weird. So what he realized was that with the law of dominance, there's not blending. It's that one trait will completely mask the presence of another trait. But the law of segregation, that second law, indicates that masked trait, the recessive trait, as he called it, didn't just go away, it would reappear in the next generation. So the third thing he did was look at two or more traits together. So, oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. So Mendel saw this over and over again, right? He would breed tall purple flowered plants with tall white flowered plants. Again, the purple would completely mask the white flowered plants. There weren't like pink flowered plants or light purple plants. They were just purple flowered plants. And 100%. And then in the second generation, you'd see 25% of the grandchildren had that white flower reappear. And he did this, again, he'd done this with tall and dwarf. He did this with flower color. He did this, I believe, with all 7 traits and saw it over and over again, these weird ratios. 100% of the dominant trait in the first generation, but then only 75% of the dominant trait in the second generation and 25% of the recessive trait reappearing in the second generation. So, all right. So what was his third law of inheritance? Well, here's where he followed two different traits in the same population. So instead of breeding two tall plants that differed only in their flower color, or the same flower color breeding, tall versus dwarf, what he did was something like um, a white flowered tall plant and a purple flowered dwarf plant. Now notice, tall is dominant and white flower is recessive. Dwarf is recessive and purple flower is dominant. So each of these plants has one dominant and one recessive trait, depending on whether you're looking at the height of the plant or the color of the flower. So what happens? The question is, what do we get? Do we get some tall white flowered plants, some tall purple flowered plants, some dwarf purple flowered plants? Do we get like a mixture of the parent generation? And it turns out that no, we get 100% tall purple flowers. So all we're seeing is the dominant traits. It just happens that one dominant trait is given by mom and one dominant trait is given by dad. Okay? So what happens in the second generation? This gets interesting. About 56% of the grandchildren, I'm sorry, it says it says F1, but it should say F2, and I realize now that I should be in slideshow mode, so that's better. Um, um, so with the grandchildren, about 56% have both dominant traits, purple flowers, tall plants. almost 19% of the plants have one dominant trait, namely tall, but the other recessive, like white flowers. And the same the other way around, right? So an equal number of, or roughly equal number of grandchildren will have the dominant flower color, but the recessive height, right? So they'll be dwarf purple flower. And only about 6% of the grandchildren will have both recessive traits. So they'll be dwarf and white flowered. So just to summarize what we see, Mendel saw the law of dominance. That is, some traits completely mask others. They don't blend. But as we saw in his second law, the law of segregation, recessive traits reappear in the second generation. And third, the traits assort independently, right? Whether or not you have purple flowers does not predict whether you're going to have a tall plant, and vice versa. So the question is why? What is it about all of this? What underlies all three laws of inheritance that Mendel discovered? I'm not going to tell you now. You're gonna have to wait for the next installment, but I will give you a hint. Okay? So when excuse me, I didn't put F2 for the grandchildren. Here we go. Much better. So when we look at just one trait, we see with the grandchildren that 75% have the dominant trait and 25% have the recessive trait. And that's very different from the ratio we started with, right? Where one parent has the dominant trait, one parent has the recessive trait. So why? We start out with a ratio of 50-50. In the first generation, we end up with a ratio of 100% dominant. In the second generation, rather than 50-50, we have 75%, 25%. Now, if we look at two traits, we see quite a different ratio, right? We start out with 50% tall white flowers and 50% purple flowers dwarf. First generation, we just see tall purple flowers. Second generation, we don't see like 75%, 25%. Rather, we see 56%, 19%, 19%, 6%. But these numbers looked very familiar to Mendel. He knew his math and he loved his numbers like he loved his bee plants. So if you're trying to figure out what the pattern is with these numbers, I will give you a hint. You can get a ratio, you can convert these percentages to ratios, right? All you have to do is divide by the smallest percentage. So if we're looking at one trait, the smallest percentage is the dwarf plants, and that's 25%. So if you divide this by 25% and this by 25%, you will get the ratio. Likewise, if we're looking at two traits, we will divide by the smallest percentage. That's the double recessive, so the white flowered dwarf plants. So you can divide all of these percentages by that smallest percentage, 6.25%, and you will get their ratio. So in this case, if you divide 25% and 75% both by 25%, you will get a ratio of 3-to-1. That makes sense, right? For every 3 tall plants, you've got one dwarf plant, or 1/4 of the population will be dwarf, 3/4 will be tall. Now, things get interesting when we move to two traits. Here we've got a ratio of 9-to-3-to-3-to-1. So 1/16 of the population will be double recessive, dwarf and white flower. 3/16 of the population will be one recessive, one dominant, that being dwarf and purple flower. Another 3/16 of the population will be the other dominant recessive pair, that is tall, white flowered. And 9/16 of the population will be double dominant, so tall and purple flower. So I want you to look at these two ratios and see if you notice anything. And for your assignment, right, we did both an F1 generation, right? We bred these parents, all 25 crosses. And then we took the virgin females and the males from each of these crosses, and we bred them together to get the second generation. So I wanted you to see if you notice similar patterns. If you notice that in the first generation, there's a dominant trait and a recessive trait when it comes to the antenna, the body color, the eye shape, the wing shape, and the eye color. And then, see if it's all 100%, as we'd expect with the first generation, if it's like Mendelian genetics. But then look at the second generation. Is it the same as the first generation? Same as the parent generation? Does it have that 3-to-1 kind of ratio? And then, of course, we can follow two traits because we bred all these together into two traits. So does it still have that 9-to-3-to-3-to-1 ratio? And if so, why? So with that, I will leave you on a cliffhanger, and I'll see you next time.